the private sector-led growth. Are they ready? You ready? Put your hands together for the team. The chair was Dr. Joe Mensah. Presenters include Mrs. Mansanete and Ms. Abna Amwa of the Stock Exchange. Let's put our hands together for the private sector-led growth team. That's a tough act to follow. I'll be praying for you.
I need all prayers. Madam Vice President, it's indeed an honor to be before you as well. And to all the members of the private sector group, please stand up so we acknowledge you. Your Excellency, this was, to be said, a most vibrant group. We missed lunch yesterday because, true to private sector form, we did not want to go home until we cracked this. So thank you very much for that. And I also acknowledge the Minister of Trade, Agribusiness and Industry, who spent a lot of time and shared a lot of input with us. We have a presentation to share with you, and we can go to the first slide. So the first thing for the private sector is the macroeconomic environment. The private sector is clear that without a stable macroeconomic environment, we are just wasting our time. And that is why we were dying to hear from the first group, and which we know we will hear from. But a strong macroeconomic environment is critical for the success of the private sector. We are more than capable of delivering the growth that Ghana needs. And so, for us, what are some of the things to do? We discussed, Minister of Finance, that it is time to consider setting a limit for debt to GDP. Yesterday, from your presentation, we saw government's hands were in too many things that the private sector is more than capable of delivering. And so, a debt to GDP cap would allow room for private sector to operate and transform our economy. So for us, we spent a lot of time there. And we are even suggesting a 60% debt to GDP ratio. We must seriously consider this. As a second point of action for us, we think it's a low-hanging fruit. There are ways in which we can quickly improve our sovereign debt rating, which is currently in default. And so the committee is willing to sit with you, with the central bank, and see how we can quickly bring back confidence, not just for domestic investors, regional investors, and international investors around our corporate sovereign, our government's sovereign rating. So that is an important thing. Your Excellency, policy consistency, coherence, and continuity across political regimes, as well as all sectors. Private sector frankly talked about the impact of breaks in policies and how it impacts our investments. This is one big ask that we want, so that there's a framework around how we discuss changes to policies and for us to plan and for our investments to bear fruit. So these are very important areas that we think government can move the needle on. Next slide, please. From the Minister of Finance's presentation, we saw the state of many of our state-owned enterprises. And today we are cut out of international capital markets. And our state-owned entities problem requires that we develop strong domestic financial and capital markets. That is the base on which we must grow our economy. And so for the state-owned enterprises, weak governance and lack of access to finance is a bane of our SOEs. And what do we propose? that GOG makes a policy that SOEs raise capital using the stock exchange, and they comply with the Securities and Exchange Commission's corporate governance requirements. Because these are requirements that talk about who should be on the board, the minimum qualification, who appoints the CEO. And these are good practices that have enabled private companies to be 200 years old. And these are good enough for all SOEs. So this is a request from us. COCOPOD and ECG, huge debts. 2015, we came up with a structure engaging capital markets that enabled us to ring-fence energy sector debts and ensure that our energy crisis was dealt with. So, our minister, let's look at engaging the capital markets again, especially for COCOPOD and ECG, around how we restructure their debts and give them room to operate. But we will demand the best corporate governance of these institutions, their transparency and accountability to the investors that create the room for them. Next slide, please. Regulatory inefficiencies. So a few of these have been talked about. Inadequate collaboration among government agencies. Our private sector finds that a lot of the discussions are fragmented. We have various platforms such as the eGov platform, the payment systems. Maybe it's time for government to come up with a communication platform that is digital, that shows the various government sectors and ministries what is going on across for sector cohesion and supporting private sector development and investment. We learned that it takes the average local company about 57 days to set up and acquire licenses. We want to shorten this significantly. We are asking for business incorporation days of 5 days from over 50 days. Foreign companies take almost 70 days. With technology, we are able to do these. We request that any institution that requires a license to operate must come out with an SLA, a service level agreement that is transparent, that can guide private sector operators who say that before I go to you with my license, I know that if all my documents are together, within 5 days, within 10 days, I should get my license. And that is an important tool for us to operate. Compliance with certificate of conformity requirements. This is so important to our importers, and it will address some of the shortfalls we have with people importing substandard issues. And finally, for us, we see that the GIPC law was promulgated in 2013. The business environment has changed significantly since then. We ask for an urgent completion of the review of the GIPC law, but not just that, but that government comes up with a policy so that every law or legislation that affects businesses must have a minimum review period of 5 years. Technology is changing, business is changing, geopolitics is changing. We can't have 10-year-old laws on our systems if we want to transform and reset our economy. Next slide, please. Tax efficiency, we can talk and talk about it. Simple, crowd in more people. We are happy to work with our tax regulators and the ministries to come up with how we do this and deploy technology for collections. Deploy technology for collections. We say our tax to GDP ratio is substandard, but none of us can confidently say that everything that's collected gets into the bucket to be counted. Technology solves that problem. Stalled growth in our agriculture sector. Madam Vice President, we discussed this a lot. Our food security is important. The private sector is willing and able to invest in agriculture and its value chain. And so we want a coherent agriculture policy, one that we seek to finance around targeted industries. We discussed industries such as the agribusiness and other priority sectors for us, which I'll come to on my next slide. But the grains, tomatoes, we looked at those products that we spend billions of US dollars every year importing. This is our priority. Land banks for cultivation is important. Next slide, please. Financing the reset. This was a question Dr. Mwako left us with yesterday. High interest rates, short-term lending, no long-term access to finance, inflation, exchange rates, eroding everything. Governor of the Central Bank, we understand that due to liquidity requirements, there's a big pot of cash that banks have left at the Central Bank. Private sector says, let's come up with a framework. Let's create a 10 billion CD fund, a 15 billion CD fund. Let's take that money and on-lend to targeted priority agreed sectors, agribusiness, garments, salt, and whatever we agree with. Let's select champions. Import substitution and some export. Let's select champions. We need to move fast, we need to move quick, we need to move agile. Let's select champions and give them big amounts of money to lift up the sectors and have a medium-term policy or strategy to then grow the SME along with them. And so for us, this is an area we want to come and meet with you and your team as private sector, as the stock exchange, so that the companies that benefit from this have a path towards the stock exchange that allows all Ghanaians to buy into the shares of companies that we create that are successful from this. SOEs and pension funds. We worked 12 years ago to liberalize the pension fund industry. By the end of this year, private pension funds will have 100 billion Ghana cedis of funds under management. That's 20-year money, 30-year money that we must deploy into the productive sectors of the economy instead of full-time investment in only government treasury bills. So our pension funds are going to work with us to get into infrastructure, real estate, selected investments in SOEs. High cost of local production is the next one, and I think my previous speaker spoke a lot about that. Low productivity and work ethics. Madam Vice President, we want to change the work ethic culture in Ghana. And we encourage not just public sector, but also private sector to enhance productivity and enable Ghana to become more competitive. We want performance management systems that pertain in the private sector to become more widespread, but also go into the public sector. So the principles of matching remuneration with productivity is something that we are going to hold dear and that we all must hold dear. We have a Fair Wages and Salaries Commission. We recommend that it be converted into a National Remuneration and Productivity Commission to focus and bring to attention what needs to be done. And that the ethics, the discipline that we see embodied in our military personnel, that every Ghanaian, of timekeeping, of taking accountability, of obeying the rules without asking who is asking me to obey the rules, must be inculcated, and a new spirit of the Ghanaian must emerge starting right now. So for the next steps for us, one of our key asks is that we believe that the macroeconomy is often diverged from the private sector. So, Governor, we want the private sector to meet with the Governor, with the Bank of Ghana and the MPC frequently, I'd say at least twice a year, where you can hear us and see how the tools you have support growth and create employment in Ghana. The second ask for us, or our commitment as a committee, is that we are going to meet in 2 months. We are going to flesh out our initiatives, and that we are going to meet in 2 months to ensure that these things, as we forewent our lunch yesterday, this is not a talk shop, and that these actions are being put in place, and we can account and create a reset Ghana, but a prosperous Ghana for everyone. Thank you very much.